I killed the final boss of Liberation and Undermine on Mythic difficulty using the 1-button rotation. Not only that, but I did it for my first cutting edge ever, while leading a guild that for 90% of our players was also their first cutting edge ever. For those that don't know, the 1-button rotation is an accessibility feature that Blizzard added this tier that allows you to just mash one button and it will perform your entire rotation. There is a trade-off though, as there is an added 0.2 second GCD penalty, meaning that realistically, you'll never be able to do more damage than somebody who is performing your rotation perfectly. For many players, this was enough to dismiss the idea of ever actually using this. But I wanted to actually make this video because I believe the 1-button rotation could have a lot of really viable uses within a raid group. Today, I'm going to talk about when I think you should use 1-button, when I think you shouldn't use 1-button, as well as some of the really interesting things that happened after progging an entire end boss while using a single button rotation. Starting out first with why did I do it? I'm aware that automatically the assumption for some people is just going to be that I use 1-button because I am bad. I'll let people make that decision for themselves, but just to plead my case, I am a multi-classer. This season I played Arcane Mage, Elemental Shaman, Dev Evoker, and Disc Priest all in Mythic Raid. I got some alright parses, some better than others, but pretty much all of these were just prog kills. In Mythic Plus, I hit 3400 IO on my Mage, and I also tanked a little bit on both a Havoc Demon Hunter and a Brewmaster, completing all 12s. Am I the best player? Absolutely not. I've still got a lot to improve on. Now, can I perform a rotation and execute mechanics on a fight without using 1-button? Absolutely. I actually started using 1-button based off of the idea that it would help me raid lead better. Something that gets talked about a lot in Mythic raiding is the implementation of a 21st man in top guilds. This player will call a fight from outside of the raid so that all 20 members of the raid can focus specifically on what they are doing. If these guilds used a traditional in-game raid leader, that player is just naturally going to play worse. Your brain can only focus on so many things at once, and it takes a lot of focus to call fights effectively. And why would you have somebody in the raid calling when you could just have somebody else swap in, and then the raid leader can perform better calls, and the player in game can perform better in game? It just completely makes sense, but for most guilds, they don't have this luxury. Playing as a 21st man doesn't really make a lot of sense for most guilds because most guilds are relatively casual, and they're playing the game for fun. It is a pretty selfless role, and you don't really get anything out of it other than the feeling of helping a group succeed, which for some people is cool, but for others, it's just not enough. But also another factor that I think worst guilds miss is that this only works if you have 20 raid members who are actually playing better than your 21st man. You're going to benefit way more from just having that guy in the game than you would from having him call from outside of the raid. That being said, you can't really argue with the idea of freeing up brain power so that you can call fights better. That's why when the 1-button rotation got announced, I was like, wait, that sounds kind of like it might be useful. I could still play from inside of the raid, but now I don't really need to think about my rotation at all. This frees me up to see the fight way more clearly. Now, this feature wasn't added until later into this patch, so I only got the opportunity to use it on both Mugsy and Gallywix. And now on Mugsy, I used it briefly and then I swapped back to performing my normal rotation as usual, but on Gallywix, I progged the entire fight using the 1-button rotation. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I made that decision. Starting with Mugsy, this was when I first attempted using the 1-button rotation during an actual Mythic prog. I tested it out on Heroic on a few bosses to make sure the damage wasn't horrible, and luckily my class actually has surprisingly good 1-button support. Among the best specs in the game to use 1-button on, both Augmentation and Devastation lose the least amount of damage compared to Sims, meaning that of all the classes that you can use 1-button on, Evoker is by far one of the best. There is one caveat though. The support for empowered spells on Evoker is quite bad. Sometimes it would force you to full channel things like your Eternity Surge, Fire Breath, or Upheaval when you didn't really want to. You could get around these things sometimes by having these abilities bound and using them manually, or sometimes you could cancel the cast manually and it would work, but sometimes it wouldn't work and it was really annoying. This in itself comes at a larger DPS loss than you would originally assume, which kind of sucked. That wasn't exactly why I stopped using the 1-button rotation on Mugsy though, as you'll notice I did intend to use it on Gallywix. No, the actual reason that I decided to perform a natural rotation on Mugsy was because the majority of this fight was boring as hell, and there wasn't even really much for me to raid lead in the first half of this fight. For those that have progged this fight, you'll notice that the real difficult part in this fight actually takes place in the second phase. This doesn't happen until 4 minutes into the fight for us, which means that for every pull for 4 minutes, I'm largely saying nothing. Remember, the benefit of me using 1-button was that I could free up my mental stack to call the fight better. But I kind of felt like as a raid leader, there wasn't a massive impact I could have during especially the first portion of this fight. And any impact that I could have, also I could just do while playing. Devastation already wasn't particularly difficult. The other thing as well is that in phase 2, it's a bit more of a damage check. And as we discussed, 1-button just does come at a damage penalty. So if I could potentially squeeze out a little bit of extra damage by actually playing the game, it felt somewhat worth it. That being said though, the second phase is more intense and I wanted to actually backtrack and look at our 1-armed bandit kill. Now this is quite embarrassing, but I think it's funny to note that during phase 2 on One Arm Bandit for our prog, I ended up doing less damage than the tanks because I was just so focused on calling. You can actually see the exact moment that I mess up and I try to cast my Fire Breath and I get knocked up, not realizing that my cast didn't go off, so then I immediately double engulf, basically just throwing all of my damage into the garbage. If you don't play Dev, then you probably don't understand this, but basically that is a huge no-no. Immediately afterwards, I get targeted with a beam and I run out of range where my Whittle Dragon hands can't really reach the boss, and shortly after, the boss dies. Now the funny part is here though, had I been using the one button rotation, I almost certainly would have done more damage. So although on Mugsy, I was like, I gotta do more damage in phase 2, it is entirely possible that while using one button rotation, I still would have done more damage. And again, this is because one button in its current state is surprisingly good. If it ends up getting nerfed, there could be a universe where it's not an option at all. But right now for raid leaders, considering how much damage you can do while using one button, it is not a bad choice. This brings us to Mythic Gallywix. Now, unlike Mugsy, Gallywix has a lot to take in at the start. A completely new fight from Heroic, and there's a lot of baits that you need to perform on the frontal that he does, and some pretty precise timings that you don't want to move too early for, but you also don't want to move too late. For things like the suppression or for our little lock gate transition that we did for Soaks, I tried to utilize things like countdowns to help keep the group in sync. I find that being super precise with calls can be very difficult if I'm not focused, and even while using one button, I would lose focus many times, calling something late or calling something too early, which would genuinely result in deaths. If people get used to me calling something on a certain timing and then I don't call it one time or I call it differently, naturally people just die. I wouldn't say that I called the fight perfectly, but I think that I did a pretty good job with it, and another thing that I noticed is that early on in Prog, one button is pretty freaking awesome. Unironically, depending on the fight, I feel like basically every single guild would benefit from having 5 to 10 pulls of all DPS using one button and just focusing on mechanics. This is where you can learn things like where do I need to stand and at what time? Where should I use my defensives? Where should I use my movement abilities? Are there any better times that I use my offensive CDs? These are all really valuable questions that you can answer while using the single button rotation. And the cool thing that ended up happening while progging this boss with single button is I started to realize just how much utility my class really has. For starters, as evokers, you can basically always be hovering. It was actually kind of crazy. Some pulls I would double hover out with rockets and then Verdant Embrace back in, pick up my bomb, and then dunk it on a reasonable time frame. Not only that, but you realize you could be using things like rescue far more often. For the first couple pulls, I was only using it once or twice a fight, but I realized that I was able to rescue on every single suppression in phase 1. This is a massive shield and makes one of our raid members' lives infinitely easier. Also, it saves me from having to use a hover charge, which again is super nice. I ended up doing this fight as augmentation despite Dev being so clearly broken this season, and I went with Aug for 2 reasons. The first is that Aug's one button support feels slightly better. Due to Disintegrate being a channeled ability as well as Dev's main spender, it kind of made it a bit clunky for one button. You're supposed to clip this ability, and any sort of motion while using one button can really confuse the rotation at times. Aug, on the other hand, has some extra instant cast, which makes it a bit easier to use while on the move. The other reason that I chose Aug, though, is because of its cheat death, which is super dope. Because of this, I ended up picking up the first bomb in the fight. For those that don't know, any bomb carriers on Mythic Gallywix, if they die, will instantly wipe the raid. So having this extra security and confidence in myself, knowing that I am not going to die, probably saved our group at least a couple pulls over the time of progging this fight. At this point of the tier, damage really didn't matter that much, so the sacrifice I was making playing Aug over Dev didn't really matter, and I feel like I actually got a lot of value out of it. As for overall damage, I ended up being pretty middle of the pack for our group. Could I have done more damage if I wasn't using one button and played Dev? Almost definitely. Would it have affected my calls during the fight though? Very likely. Another question I had to consider though is, am I even getting enough value out of my calls to justify the one button rotation? And that's the real question, because even though I can say that this is freeing up my brain power to raid lead, am I actually effectively using that extra room in my mental stack to make a significant difference for my raid? And honestly, the answer to that question might just be no. Maybe I'm not there yet as a raid leader. As I mentioned on Mugsy, and for many pulls on Galley, I definitely didn't feel like it was always worth it. Raid leading is exhausting, and saying the same things over and over, pull after pull, it's really easy to lose focus or lose energy and begin to call worse and worse. I think on my good pulls, I was really good. And on my bad pulls, I could easily be doing the same thing while doing a normal rotation. Something that I realized though is that you don't intuitively know what to do right away once you've had your mental stack freed up like this. Naturally, a lot of the time, you'll just end up staring at your bars anyway to make sure that your rotation is doing its thing. I basically had to recondition my eyes to look at the places that are more valuable. Instead of looking down here, I'm trying to look more over here or over here. And frequently, I'm still missing information that is over here. I still need to make some improvements to my UI before going into next tier, but as I mentioned before, I think the really incredible thing that I experienced while using one button is that it opens up your mind to all the things that you're doing suboptimally in your game. There is so much more that you could be doing better as a player, and by removing the clutter of a difficult rotation and just focusing on your utility, movement, and positioning, it has the potential to make you an infinitely better player. That's going to do it for me today. If you guys enjoyed this video, I would love to hear your comments down below. Also, if you enjoy stuff like this, you may also want to check out my video that I made on Mythic Mugsy, talking about our experience as a guild progging the boss from pull 1 all the way to pull 230. Finally, if you want to catch me live on Twitch, I have been streaming our prog on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Feel free to come hang out and say hi. I would love to see you. Other than that, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.